Hi. So for Tuesday, we are gonna kind of jump into some political geography information and terms. And these terms are gonna be using for today's discussion post, but also for an assignment on Thursday. So once again, from yesterday, political geography, we're really taking a look at how people organize space. And one of the ways we think about how they organize space is into country boundaries and how do they place those borders and boundaries around different countries. And so we're going to be thinking a little bit about the two different terms today. One of them is going to be state, and the other one's going to be nation. And so as long as we can kind of understand what those two terms mean, we'll be able to put them together into different types of countries and different types of nations. So in human geography or in political geography, we're going to start using the term state, not to refer to a state like Minnesota or an internal boundary within a country. But instead, the term state, the definition is just basically going to mean a country. So when I refer to a state, I'm really just talking about a country. So a formal definition would be a politically organized territory with a permanent population, a defined territory, and a government. And so states are internationally recognized. So in order to really officially be considered a country or a state, you have to be recognized by other countries. So for example, the United States of America is in itself a state. So is Canada, so is Mexico. They are recognized by other countries. They have a government. They are sovereign, meaning that they have the right to make their own laws and to rule themselves. And they have territorial integrity, which means that they have the right to defend themselves. They can have a military. And so, really, just a state is what we think of as a country, and we definitely have some probably background knowledge into what that looks like. There are definitely some regions of the world that where whether or not they are a state is in conflict, where they're not necessarily recognized internationally. An example would be Taiwan. Taiwan is an island off the coast of China. And for some people living in Taiwan, they want to be their own country, independent of China. And for many, in many respects, they function as their own country. But China still believes that Taiwan is part of China. And some people in Taiwan still believe that they are the true government of China. And so Taiwan is not internationally recognized as its own country. Um, and so there are some areas that are not as clear cut as our borders and boundaries make it out to be all the time. So once again, this is our world map, and you can see like the political divisions here are really just those state boundaries. So divisions between countries, and there are, like I said before, definitely some areas that are maybe up for dispute as to whether or not they are their own country or not. There are also regions of the world that really are not, they're owned by other countries, that are colonies of other countries. And so you can see some examples. One large example would be Greenland. Greenland is actually owned by Denmark. We have, in the United States, have a number of colonies still in the Pacific Ocean. So, for example, Guam is a U.S. territory. So it's not its own state, it's not its own country. It's not really entirely part of the United States, but it is, it probably does have its own government, its own governor, and is owned by the United States, but doesn't really fall into that state category. All right, so the second term, so if a state is a country, when we are going to use the term nation, we're referring to a group of people. So not a country, like not a territory that would be considered a country. But a nation is really more of a cultural group of people that see themselves as distinct. They have a common ancestry, so they can kind of tie their ancestral roots back to the same groups of people. And they also see themselves as kind of having claim to a geographic area. So they are from a homeland, or they're from a particular region of the world. Now, in this sense, there are so many different nations in the world. If I think about my own nationality and I think about being Finnish and English and German, and a couple other groups of people. I'm not just of one nation of people, but I have multiple nations within myself. But there's also people that see themselves as being very tied to that ancestry and also being very tied to a particular region of the world. It's hard for us in this country to really get a sense of always what that means because we are a nation of mostly immigrants. And so most people in the United States have immigrated here at some point in their family's history. But if we think about the indigenous groups of people, Native Americans who live in the United States, they very much see themselves as having that common ancestry, the claim to a geographic area. And so if I were to take a look at the Lakota people, the Lakota homeland might reach from this area, might be particularly in this area. And we're talking about the Kurds later on, but the Kurds are a nation, a group of people that lay claim to a region of the Middle East. If we look at Africa, this map of Africa right here is showing the nation boundaries of Africa, the ethnic group boundaries. It is not showing, as you may suspect, the actual boundaries of the countries. So a country like Nigeria, which is right around here, has so many different nations living within the boundaries with many different languages spoken, many different religious practices, but people that see themselves as distinctly different, all within a particular country. So with that then, there's lots of different ways that we can match this concept of state boundaries and nation boundaries and put them together. So we're going to talk about 3 different configurations or 3 different ways that those 2 concepts, a state and nation, can kind of fit together. So the first one is going to be a nation state. So if you take a look at the second term here, whatever the second term is what we are talking about. So a nation state is a state. It is a country. Okay, so a state is also a country. A state that has a single nation in its boundaries. So when a nation has mostly the same boundaries as a state is part of. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Examples are Iceland and Japan. So I'll talk about Japan. When we take a look at the country of Japan, this is Japan right here. About 98% of the people living in Japan are Japanese. They see themselves as the nation of Japan. They are ethnically Japanese. They speak Japanese. They see themselves as distinct culturally. There are small minority groups living in Japan, particularly Koreans, that are not Japanese. But Japan doesn't have a lot of immigration. People can't just up and move to Japan. And so it's pretty homogenous. There's really just kind of one major cultural group in Japan. Therefore, it is a nation state. Also, there are not very many, but there are. There's not as many Japanese people living in other countries. However, that's not entirely true. But this idea that one nation living within that country. Now, there are no 100% nation states in the world. Every country in the world has, to some extent, diversity. But the countries that have a lot less diversity within their population are considered to be nation states. So another example would be Iceland. Most people living in Iceland are going to be Icelandic. They are of that ethnicity. They are of that ancestry. They are of that nation. One thing you'll notice about Iceland and Japan is that they're also both islands. It's a little bit easier to have a single group of people in your boundaries when you are isolated by bodies of water. There's less likely to be migration or easy migration to your country. Not all islands are nation states, but it might be easier to be a nation state if you are an island. All right. So the next configuration of those 2 is a multinational state. And this is what the majority of countries in the world are. and what we are, but it's a state. So once again, whatever the second term is, that is what is going to be the phrase, like the term that you should focus on. So whatever the second term is, we're talking about a state here that has multiple nations in its boundaries. So a state with more than one nation inside its borders. Nearly every state in the world is a multinational state. However, these are some really good examples. The United States. We are an extremely diverse nation. We have lots of people that have different ancestries. We all go to the same schools and we go to, we share public spaces and we share lots of things. We are definitely a multinational state. Canada as well. Canada has some distinct national groups, like in Quebec, the Quebecos nation, the French nation in Quebec. They also have a lot of indigenous groups, especially in the north, that are very distinct nationally. But they also have a lot of immigration. They have a lot of nations of people living within their boundaries. India is also a nation state. Belgium is considered to be a nation state, but it also kind of has two major different nations. So Belgium is pretty small. This is the example of Belgium over here. They have the Dutch-speaking Flemish population in the north and the French-speaking Walloon population in the south. And so they're pretty much just kind of two major nations. But because of that, they have more than one nation in their state. And so this would be this diagram right here. If these are state boundaries, if this little piece of the pie is one state, and these are nation boundaries, there are multiple nations within that state. Okay, so the last term for today is going to be a stateless nation. And once again, if we look at the second term, we're not talking about a country now. We are talking about a nation. So we're talking about a group of people, and they are a group of people that do not have a country to call their own. They are stateless. So nations or ethnic groups, which are not the majority population in any country. So we have group people. They're not the majority population in any country. But here's the key thing. They believe that they should have their own state. They believe, and they do not. Nowhere in the world do they have their own state. They do not have their own country that they can kind of call their own for their people. So they are considered to be stateless, but they really think that they should have the right to their own state. So an example would be the Kurdish population. The Kurds are the largest stateless nation in the world. They are a large group of people that are currently inhabit an area that is now modern day Iraq, Turkey, Syria, and Iran. And this yellow area right here is kind of what they see as their homeland, but they don't have a country to call their homeland. And they are mixed up in a number of other countries. They have been persecuted in some of those countries. They've been treated unfairly in some of those countries. And they believe that they should have, they have fought to have their own country, but they do not. So those are the three kind of major configurations that you should know for your activity today and then also on Thursday. Please let me know if you have any questions. You're going to be taking a look at the Kurds, and for today's discussion post a little bit more, you'll see this graphic, and then you'll also be answering some of these questions just to hopefully show that you understand what those words mean. All right, and as always, feel free to email me or contact me if you have any questions. Have a good day.